So last week we looked together at evidence and reasons for the truth of Scripture, and so we're going to take a look at a particular element, the central element of the scriptural claim, which is that our Savior, Jesus Christ, has risen again from the dead. I pulled a quote from Tim Keller's book that I've been encouraging you to read. In fact, we have a dozen or so copies of that. Sean was going to bring those in, and he may... Does anybody see a big stack of books anywhere? Sean was going to bring. I'll try to get those to you. They're $10 a piece. It's my favorite apologetics book. So if you want one of those copies of The Reason for God, I would encourage you to pick one up. You can get one from me. But here's a line that I think is important. It's there at the top of your notes. If Jesus rose from the dead, then you have to accept all He said. If He didn't rise from the dead, then why worry about any of what He said? The issue on which everything hangs is not whether or not you like His teaching, but whether or not He rose from the dead. Something you've heard me say on a number of occasions. I try to say it as I preach on the resurrection at Easter. If you say you're going to die and rise again, and you do, you get to be Lord. All right? You get to be in charge. Your claims have to be considered, no matter what they are. And that's really Keller's point. Before we quibble about details of teaching and even run that quibbling back into the Old Testament or whatever, we got to look and confront the fundamental historical truth claim of Scripture that our Savior has risen again from the dead. If He has, then it really lays the foundation for the legitimacy and the reliability of everything else that the Scriptures claim. Miracles, who God is and how we're saved, all of that flows out of that one fact. And if Christ hasn't risen again from the dead, you remember what Paul said about that in 1 Corinthians 15? Then why bother? If Jesus is not alive, then all of this other religious talk, they're just a set of religious ideas that you can put alongside Confucius and Buddha and all the rest that sprinkle a little sunshine into our lives while we ignore the fact that we're helpless and hopeless and destined for an eternity apart from God. Because if Jesus isn't alive, then there is no hope. But if He is, then Jesus is the Lord. And so what we've been doing every week is we tackle these different areas of apologetic concern. Is I've been encouraging you, there's two approaches to apologetics. One is the evidentiary approach, and that is classic apologetics. It's arguing from data to a conclusion. It's a deductive approach, and that's a great way to think about apologetics because many people who have questions or objections to Christianity, they do so at a particular data point. There's some particular detail that they're struggling with. And so when someone raises the issue, we don't see people die and rise again. And if that's the kind of thing that has never happened before, then we don't have any real good evidence for it happening with the claims related to Jesus. And so an evidentiary approach says, well, let's start with that. Let's start with the issue of the miraculous and move from there. And so the evidentiary approach is a good place to start. And that's how we'll start tonight. But the other strategic approach is the presuppositional approach. It's to say, when you say Jesus couldn't have risen again from the dead, on what basis are you making those claims? What do you think about how history works? How do we know anything? How do you understand whether or not the universe is closed or open to divine intervention? And if you think it's closed, how do you make that claim? What do you think the message of Christianity really is trying to say, and can it make that claim without making a claim to resurrection from the dead? Presuppositional approach tries to get up underneath maybe some surface objections to really talk about fundamental claims and a fundamental worldview. And I think what's important about that, and we'll get to it, is skeptics think they don't have a religious worldview. but everyone has a religious worldview. Everyone has a faith claim about how it all works or why it all is. And even if your claim is there is no meaning in life, that's a faith claim. And that's a worldview claim, and it's one that has to be justified. So we'll look at both of these approaches tonight. And so, first of all, the evidentiary approach to the resurrection. The main claim for the skeptic of the... Well, y'all tell me, what are some of the reasons why people can't accept Jesus' resurrection from the dead? What are some of the objections that get raised?
Nobody has ever done it.
Okay, all right. The miracle problem. Nobody's ever risen again from the dead, and so if it hasn't happened in the past, there's no reason for us to expect it now. All right. So the problem of miracles. Why else? What are people's objections about the biblical claims about the resurrection from the dead? Well, I'll say this. If there really was no miracle and Jesus really didn't rise again from the dead, how did we wind up with the New Testament? What would a skeptic say about how we wound up with these four Gospels and these...
Only his disciples saw him.
And what's the problem with only his disciples saw him?
It made it up.
It's the problem with the source, okay? So there's going to be some objections related to the source.
If that one thing is not true, then none of it is reliable.
Right, and so it's sort of you start to pull the string out of the sweater. If you can show that the resurrection didn't happen, then you can pull the whole thing apart. All right. What might some other objections be to the data that we have from the Bible about the resurrection?
It was made up.
It was only a handful of people, and they made it up. And why did they make it up? Do you know any of the reasons that are given for why these handful of peasants would make up a story like this?
To be popular.
It's fun to start a religion, right? Okay. Did it make them popular? No, got them killed. So there you go. So why would they say such things? What are some of the claims of why a story like this would be made up? What are some of the claims about when it was made up?
To rationalize why they believe what they believe.
All right, there you go. So one of the most typical, classic objections is Jesus was really great and nice. He was a good teacher, and when you were around him, you just felt these good things in your heart, and he made you want to be better. And then the religious leaders didn't like it, and so they killed the Messiah. But his followers just kept on feeling, this warmth and how good Jesus was and how important he was. And these teachings were so great that they just sort of crafted this story as a way to have a story to talk about this good feeling and this positive experience. And so they just kind of invented this resurrection thing as a way to say everything Jesus said was still very important. It ought to be considered important. So the church made it up later to justify believing in Jesus' authority. That's a very common objection, by the way. And then you just extend that out, that it was made up. This is, as I mentioned last week, more of the Da Vinci Code objection, that in the year 300, the church really invented the divinity of Christ in order to exercise control and to use to create a real sense of spiritual authority, so they could get citizens of the Roman Empire to get in line because they had the Savior and they had this supreme figure. And so the church invented worshiping Jesus as God 300 years later. This is often referred to as the difference between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. Anybody heard that distinction before? There's a difference between the Jesus of history, who was just a good man with some good teachings, and the Christ of faith, this being that was invented by the church in order to give people something to worship. All right? Now the question is that plausible? Are there good reasons to perpetuate those objections. Well, let's just walk through some of them. So one of the first real problems has to do with the expectations of resurrection from the dead in the ancient world. The claim is that the disciples wanted for Jesus to rise again from the dead. They didn't want him to be dead anymore, and so because they wanted him to rise again from the dead, they sort of expected him to rise again from the dead, they just invented this resurrection from the dead story. That's one of the claims that's made. But here's what you need to know. In the ancient world, there was absolutely zero expectation of a dead person rising again then. Well, and what I'll show you is, and Paul says this, to Greeks that idea was foolishness, and to Jews it was a scandal. That the disciples were not expecting for Jesus to rise again from the dead. And how do you know that the disciples were not expecting Jesus to rise again from the dead, even from the evidence of the Bible?
They went back to the
They went home. Every time Jesus said things like, I'm going to die on a cross and then I'm going to rise again 3 days later, what was the disciples' response to that? I wonder what he means. I know Jesus just pulling out his hair. What do you mean? What do I mean? I'm going to die and then I'm going to rise again three days later. And they really can't conceptualize that. So how'd that work in the Greco-Roman world? Among pagans, their view of death is that death was powerful and permanent. Death was really the end. They tease this out in a variety of ways. One is Hades. Hades was the place of shadowy existence in the underworld, crossing the river Styx, and then the disembodied spirit would spend the rest of eternity in the place of death. The Elysian Fields is sort of the friendlier version of Hades. Normal, it would just be sort of a Elysian Fields would have been this nice place that looked very much like Earth, maybe a little boring. Okay, not a lot going on, a lot of resting. It's frankly where a lot of the medieval notions about what heaven is like is come from. It's just sort of billowy and flowy and sunny, and everyone's taking naps. That idea.
Is there any significance that it was 3 days later instead of not 1 day, 2 days? What do you see?
Right. So I think the significance of Jesus being dead for 3 days is one's historical and one maybe is rooted in an Old Testament expectation. 3 days. Well, remember how long was it before Jesus went and saw Lazarus?
4.
4. Why? Why did Jesus wait 4 days?
To make sure the spirit weren't hovering around.
They were good and dead. And 3 days would have done the trick as well. In fact, when Jesus says, we roll the stone away, remember what, I think it was Martha? What did she say? He stinketh. The KJV says stinketh. Okay? So 3 days is good and dead, even notions of the spirit hanging around the grave or whatever, that would have been gone. So somebody is, well, graveyard dead, as we say here in the South. And then Jesus mentions Jonah being in the whale for 3 days. And in just the same way, so there's that typology there as well that may have some, that does have some significance in it.
I was just thinking because of the Trinity.
Oh, yeah. Maybe a Trinitarian idea in there, because always when 3 comes up, maybe there. That's right. So the pagans, they weren't expecting and wouldn't have been moved by a claim of resurrection from the dead. That was not part of their hope. They thought the physical body was the worst thing about us. You wouldn't want to bring the physical body back from the dead. That's the whole hope of salvation. That comes to this, it's written there, the Platonic release. The Platonic view was that the soul is freed from the body. And the whole idea of heaven, of life after death, would be to leave the body behind. They were disgusted by the idea of a bodily resurrection. In fact, Jesus is preaching to Paul is preaching to the Greek philosophers, the majority of whom would have been Platonists. And he's rolling along, and they're kind of interested in his message. When did a bunch of those philosophers on Mars Hill give up on Paul's message when he said Jesus rose again from the dead. And they just, no way. That's not even what we want. The body is bad. The spirit is good. The message of resurrection from the dead, we're not interested in that. And so the Platonic idea is leaving the body behind. And then you hear stories about, a lot of times, Bill Maher was a big advocate of this, that the New Testament resurrection stories mirror resurrection stories of like Augustus Caesar. It's claimed that he rose again from the dead. But that's not what pagans meant when they talked about Caesar still being alive and worshipped as God. They would look up into the sky and see a constellation and say, there's Caesar Augustus up there in the stars. They didn't believe that Caesar Augustus rose again bodily from the dead. They knew he was still rotting in his tomb, but in some kind of spiritual way, because he was this great, wonderful person, people like Caesar Augustus would have life after death like that, but not ordinary people. And certainly not someone, because here's another big problem with Jesus' resurrection. It has to do with Jesus' death. How did Jesus die? And what did Greco-Romans think about Jesus' manner of death? Cursed. Yeah, Jews, cursed is the one who hangs on the tree. And then Carrie and I did a little investigation of what crucifixion meant in the days of Rome. It was designed to be the most disgusting, humiliating, shameful thing, and anyone who made a claim that a crucified person is God would have been laughed out of the room. Only the really beautiful and good and powerful people, like the Caesars, had a right to any kind of post-death experience. And certainly they wouldn't have brought their bodies with them. If there was any idea of coming back to life, it might have been necromancy. It might have been calling someone out from the grave, out from Hades, reincarnation. But all of that was only life for a little while, and then all of these people would die again. So there's no expectation of the kind of resurrection that's being claimed in the Gospels. There's no expectation by the Roman or by the pagans. And then the Old Testament. The Old Testament view of life after death is slowly developing. We know that the Old Testament is progressive revelation, and so in the early portions and even into the Psalms is the idea of Sheol, but there's not a lot of detail about what Sheol meant, how long it lasted, or what it was like. But by the time of the Psalms, you have these expressions of hope. The Holy One is not going to be abandoned to decay. That's what Peter preaches in Acts chapter 6. And then into the prophetic, exilic section of the Old Testament, dry bones being made alive again in Ezekiel 37. The servant of the Lord in Isaiah 53, rising again from death or emerging and not being defeated by death. And then the clearest expression is in Daniel chapter 12, but this is towards the conclusion of the Old Testament, that there was going to be a final resurrection to judgment. And in Jesus' day, that was the Jewish expectation about resurrection. Not that somebody would die again and rise again in the middle of history, but on Judgment Day, the dead would come out of their graves, and at that moment they would all be judged. And that was the idea. You see there, the Second Temple, that's just the time period of Jesus, the expectations during Jesus' day. The Sadducees, don't look at your notes. What did the Sadducees believe about resurrection? They didn't. That's why they were sad, you see. Oh, y'all caught on to my joke now. Right. So you could be a leading Jew and not even believe in the possibility of resurrection at all. Right? Jews also at the time had mixed in Platonic views of the immortality of the soul. That was really more Alexandrian Judaism. They're in Egypt. Certainly the idea of bodily resurrection at the judgment. and that the faithful then would be in the new creation. But all of that was going to happen at some later date. And then here's to me is the knockdown evidence. Jesus was not the only Jew to be called Messiah. There were a number of men who rose up in the years before and after Jesus who were claimed to be Messiah. And what was the fate of all of those other messianic claimants? The Romans got tired of them, and that was it. How many of them were announced as having risen again from the dead? Zero. Zero. Number one, because they didn't rise again from the dead, and two, because no one expected for them to rise again from the dead. Okay? So the idea, here's the whole point of this. The idea that the writers of the New Testament would make that up because they were just sort of filling in some set of presupposed expectations flies in the face of everything we know externally, and then everything we know about what the Gospels themselves say about what the disciples were expecting. They absolutely did not think Jesus was going to rise again from the dead. So it's hard to make the claim that it didn't happen and they made it up. Is that y'all following that? Y'all grabbing hold of that? The best explanation then for first century Jews to start saying that someone had risen again from the dead, who had said he would rise again from the dead, even though they didn't understand it. What's the best explanation for suddenly these men begin to claim and willingly give their lives for the claim that Jesus had risen again bodily from the dead? What's the best explanation for that? Is that that's what happened. Okay, so let's keep rolling through. Then we look at the resurrection and the Apostle Paul. What I have listed there is Gary Habermas's Minimal Facts. And if you'll Google that, there's about a 45-minute lecture given by Gary Habermas, who's at Liberty University. His PhD's from Michigan. It's a great, and I'm going to give you a small rendition of it, but you'll get the full meal deal if you look up Gary Habermas. So here's what you get in the writings of Paul that help us with the justification for the historicity of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. And it starts in 1 Corinthians. So in 1 Corinthians, beginning in verse 1, you have very clear claim from the Apostle Paul. He says, I delivered to you a first important, that's what was also I received, that Jesus was crucified, buried, and rose again. He appeared to 500, and he appeared to the brother of Jesus and Peter and a few others, and then to 500, and least of all, as one untimely born, he appeared to me. All right, are y'all tracking with that part? Very clear claim. And then all of that entire chapter is going to be this long discussion of Jesus' bodily resurrection from the dead, because the Corinthians are having trouble believing in Jesus' bodily resurrection. They want to be Christians, but they hate the idea of Jesus rising again bodily because they're pagan Platonists. And so we have in 1 Corinthians 15 the longest discussion and most careful articulation of some specifics of Jesus rising again from the dead. And so here's why that's important, okay? And we hear in this, let me tell you why it's important. It's if you'll see there in point 2, what we have in 1 Corinthians 15 is what's called early attestation. We know for a historical certainty. And this is agreed to by atheist and secular ancient historians. Any ancient secular historian worth his salt would agree with me about what I'm fixing to tell you about Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. Okay? That's why Gary Habermas calls it the minimum facts approach. What he says is, I'm only going to use the facts that a secular historian of ancient history would allow in. and I can still demonstrate the historical reliability of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. So I'm only going to use the facts that they would let me use in their most restricted view. And so here's what even the most secular, atheistic historians of ancient history would agree is true. We know for certain that there was a Jew named Paul who was in Corinth in 52 AD. And he wrote these words in 52 AD. The reason we know for a historical certainty that the Apostle Paul was in Corinth in 52 AD is, and I think it was the late part of the 18th century, there was an archaeological dig in the area around Delphi in Greece, and a big stone was unearthed, and on it is written, basically, Gallio is proconsul in Corinth during the reign, and it gives the 16th year of the ascension of Claudius or whatever. That's how you could get a good time stamp. And so we know from Acts chapter 16 that Luke records that Gallio was proconsul in Achaia, which is the area where Corinth was when Paul went to Corinth. So we have independently attesting evidence that Paul was in Corinth in a particular year, 52 AD. In 52 AD, Paul wrote these things about Jesus' resurrection from the dead. So how far after the events do we have evidence that's written down? How far after the fact is 52 AD? Let's just round it to 20. Okay? Now here's what I'm going to tell you. To have actual literary historical evidence 20 years after the fact of an event in ancient history is the best. It's the best evidence of any ancient historical evidence that we have. 20 years after the fact, you have someone who now is thousands of miles away from where it happened, yet still within the living memory of people who were there. I think one of the reasons why Paul lays out he appeared to 500, one of the things I think Paul is saying is if you want to hop in a boat or start down a Roman road, you can, in 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 weeks, you can get from Corinth to Jerusalem and go ask someone. Ask them if they've heard the story. Ask them to show you the tomb. Paul is making it as clear as he possibly can. If you want to know the truthfulness of what I'm telling you, go find out. As I shared with you last week, the nearest literary evidence we have of Alexander the Great is hundreds of years later before we have an actual literary account. Herodotus writing, I think 200 years later, something like that, before anyone has written it down. Yet within 20 years of it happening, a historical figure, everyone believes there was an Apostle Paul who was a follower of Jesus, who was in Corinth 20 years after the fact, and writes about a tradition that he's received. This has been the long belief of the church. This is what the church has always believed. Okay, so that's what you have in Paul's letters, because we can be so certain about the dating of those letters, and you have written down evidence of the church's belief, not that Jesus was a nice guy with some nice teachings, he was just a good person, but that Jesus was being worshiped as God, and that he was being viewed as one who had risen again from the dead. And then into the Gospels, written between the 60s and the 90s AD, they give you a lot of variety in their accounts, but also the things that they insist on also follow the principles of historical reliability. First of all, this claim of an empty tomb. They all agree that there is an empty tomb. That's just a unique way of characterizing something. Instead of just saying, well, he died or he was crucified or they buried him, they want to speak of the tomb being empty. that we went out there to where he was supposed to be and he was not there. Empty tomb and real encounters. That we didn't see the empty tomb and infer, oh, he must have risen again from the dead. Because what are some other explanations for the tomb being empty? Well, the body was stolen, but what speaks to the illegitimacy of the theft of the body? Well, you got the habeas corpus, not habeas corpus, that's not the right thing. What is it where you have to have the body? Anyway, there's a legal term for it. But we have evidence in Matthew's gospel where he says they started making this story up very early, but even though the guards were posted to make sure that no one stole the body, then they paid some Roman soldiers to go around and tell everybody that the body had been taken away. So, empty tomb and real encounters with the resurrected Christ. I have there the lack of scriptural embellishment. What that means is instead of a very mythological telling, because when the stories were crafted to tell about Caesar Augustus being divinized, it's got dragons and snakes and spinning stars and people are falling asleep in trances and having dreams and it's very clearly the product of mythologized language. What you have in the Gospels is this very, very, very historical telling. There's historical detail. There is clarity. It's a true-to-life account of a burial. A case can even be made that really there's an advance in the way history is done because of the kind of detail, unique kind of detail that you get in the Gospels. And what that means is it's written, the only way to really account for what the Gospels are like is that somebody who was there saw it. And they're just writing down what they saw. They're writing down what happened, what they saw transpire. It does have an appropriate variance. There are differences in each of the accounts. But as we talked about last week, when you have several different witnesses looking at something from several different angles, you can expect to have different emphases and variance in the accounts. Again, from last week, when all the witnesses are telling exactly the same story, what does that mean? Usually means they're lying if they've gotten their story together. So every little detail is exactly the same. So that kind of variety is appropriate. All the different kinds of appearances and the number of people that were appeared to, so that it isn't just 12 people saying they all saw the same thing, but hundreds of people saying so. Early confession, what that means, as I've already said, is from the earliest expressions of Christianity that we have within just a few decades, Jesus is being worshiped all over the Roman Empire as one who's risen again from the dead. They didn't make it up later. And then counterproductive details. Who were the first witnesses of the resurrection? If you're going to make it up, you don't have women there. Women couldn't testify in court. Their reliability was suspect. They weren't justified in thinking that back then, ladies. I'm just saying that's the way it was. If you're going to make up a story, you wouldn't have detail like that. And who were the dummies? Who were the dummies in the resurrection story? The disciples. If Peter is going to make it up, especially Peter, what do you think a made-up Peter would sound like in a made-up resurrection story? He's believed it all along. He was the first one there. When everybody else doubted, he was right there. He wouldn't have included a denial and a refusal and a confusion to believe and going back and fishing, right? All of those details are counterproductive to the idea of an invented resurrection. And then, of course, the most counterproductive detail is having Jesus crucified. There's lots of ways to execute someone. Do it with honor. Maybe he dies in battle or dies, jumping in front of someone else, something that could be configured as being militarily significant. But to be crucified, it is the worst. It is proof positive that someone is cursed. It's proof positive that someone is hated by God for them to be crucified on a Roman cross. Everyone would have agreed with that, Jews and Romans. And so the only reason to write that Jesus had been crucified is what? Because that's what happened. And everyone knows about it, and there's no sense in denying it. In fact, what the church came to discover, it's because he was crucified that he's able to save. Okay? So, and then we continue to look at some of the early sources, the existence, crucifixion, and resurrection of Jesus in non-biblical sources. All right, I have, if on the back of your piece of paper, I have longer excerpts of these sources, so that you can look at them in length or go look them up. But there are other relevant historical records of Jesus' life, Jesus' death, and the claim that he is risen again from the dead by his followers. And so you have Josephus, lived from 3700, from 37 AD to 100 AD. And here's what he says. I won't go through the whole thing, but you see that on the back of your page. Joseph in the Antiquities of the Jews mentions Jesus specifically. Mentions that he was the Messiah, and many people followed him, Jews and Greeks. Mentions Pilate and the cross, and the appearance on the third day. And then the last sentence, and the tribe of Christians so called after him has still to this day not disappeared. And so Josephus is probably writing in the 90s AD, and the Christian movement is still growing and still professing that they believe Jesus has risen again from the dead. And then rabbinic sources. I have the year 220. The rabbinic sources, have you ever heard of the Talmud, the Jewish Talmud? It's a long document that was composed over hundreds and hundreds of years. But about 220 BC is when it was finished. There was no more additions to the Babylonian Talmud. So you don't really know how far back from 220 these statements go. But you do have in the Babylonian Talmud, so these are non-Christian Jews. And they speak about Jesus the Nazarene being stoned because he practiced sorcery, incited people to idol worship, and led the Jewish people astray. Okay, so it's not a denial of Jesus' existence or of Jesus' execution. And you have that in the rabbinic sources. Then there's a Gentile named Mara. He wrote a letter in 73. Did I say he was Jewish? He's Gentile. He's a Syrian. Writing, the Romans have him imprisoned in Syria. And he writes, what benefit did the Athenians obtain by putting Socrates to death? What benefits of killing Pythagoras? Or what did the Jews benefit by murdering their wise king? And so Mara is actually speaking positively about Jesus, but here this is in 73 AD, and he's already able to speak of the significance of Jesus' death alongside Socrates and Pythagoras. It was that well known by 73 AD in places like Syria, and you can imagine beyond there. And then Pliny, Tacitus, Suetonius, and Thallus are all Roman historians who write about Jesus. Real quick, I won't read all of them to you, but I'll give you a little bit of context. So Pliny is writing back and forth to the emperor, talking about trying and executing Christians. And he's just letting the emperor know, I'm having to kill these Christians from time to time. Just want you to know how I go about it, and how I try to get them to deny Jesus. And then if I can't get them to deny Jesus, then they have to be killed. And so he's given a little summary of what they believe. They meet on a fixed day. They sing responsively a hymn to Christ as God. And so here, about 100 AD, it's a commonplace and well known by all that Christ is worshipped as God by people who call themselves Christians. Then that's Pliny. And then Tacitus, he is writing about the Nero burning Rome in 64 AD and records these terrible persecutions that break out against the Christians because Nero is trying to blame the Christians for setting Rome on fire. And so he's given a little background. The originator of the name Christ was executed as a criminal by the procurator Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Those are very specific historical details that this pagan who doesn't like Christianity is recorded as things that are being well known and believed, and this would have been around 110. Suetonius is writing a history of the Emperor Claudius, telling about a time in 48 AD when all of the Jews were kicked out of Rome, as the Jews were making constant disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus. This is a misspelling and maybe even a mishearing of the name Christus, and he expels them from Rome. And then finally, Thallus. Now, the reason we know what Thallus wrote is because it's recorded in something that Julius Africanus wrote after the fact. But we don't have the original of what Thallus said, so I'm just making you aware of that. But Thallus, in about 100 AD, wrote, on the whole world there pressed a most fearful darkness, and the rocks were rent by an earthquake. In many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. This darkness, Thallus in the third book of his history calls, appears to me without reason an eclipse of the sun. So Julius Africanus is a Christian, and he's writing about what happened on the day Jesus was crucified, and he finds some evidence of Thallus saying, yes, there was this darkness that fell and people ascribed it to Jesus, but it was really just an eclipse. So my point is, in 100 AD, you had a historian writing about the darkness that fell over Judea when Jesus was crucified, that was something that was known and believed at the time. Okay? So, and from this perspective of ancient history, this is overwhelming levels of evidence for an event that occurs, because having actual evidence from the same time period is so vanishingly rare, because we have very, very little of anything that was written during that time period. Frankly, very little was written, period, because most people couldn't write, and then very little of it was retained because it was all written on papyrus and parchment, and much of what was written down didn't survive into the present. So, for the evidential approach to the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, the best explanation for all the evidence inside of the Bible and the great deal of evidence that we find outside of the Bible, the best explanation for all of this evidence and its age is that what's being claimed really happened. All right? And so then let's turn it around and let's do the presuppositional approach to the resurrection, which is this. If someone says, well, I just don't believe Jesus rose again from the dead, then you can ask, well, what is your alternative explanation for the Bible and the church? What is your alternative explanation for what we have in the Bible and what we see in 2,000 years of Christianity? What's your explanation of the event? If Jesus didn't rise again from the dead, what do you think happened? And these are some of these theories that you've heard across the years. The swoon theory. What's the swoon theory? He just passed out. I heard someone say, well, let me, to the person who raises that objection, well, come with me. I will beat you to a pulp, whip you with a cat of nine tails, beat you with the Roman rod. Jesus would have been one continuous hematoma, probably from his ankles to the back of his head. It resulted in punctured lungs, unbelievable blood loss. Most of the time, that cat of nine tails would lacerate major arteries in the back, and many times, the person who was going to be crucified never survived the beating that had to be given before the crucifixion occurred. And then, bang some nails through your Achilles tendon and between your radius and ulna, and then have you hang there under your own weight for several hours under the Judean sun, and then stab you. And then experts in killing people say, he's dead. but really, he just passed out. And so what I heard the guy say, let me do that to you, see if you swoon when all of that's over, right? It's a process and a picture, and 3 days, the swoon theory. And then if Jesus had risen again or had swooned and revised, do you think people's reaction would have been, oh, he's risen again from the dead? What would Jesus have looked like? Yeah, just a bloody pulp. Okay, so the swoon theory doesn't work. The body was stolen. We've already talked about that. Claims at the time were already made. And the main response to the body was stolen is people were willing to be martyred for something that was a big lie. The hallucination. There was just such a desire for, on the part of this group of people, for Jesus to be resurrected from the dead. They had a collective hallucination. Two problems. One is, as I've already said, there's no expectation for Jesus to rise again from the dead. And I got this from Strobel's Case for Christ. The psychological and scientific evidence for a collective hallucination just doesn't hold up. For something like this, there's no reason to believe in the possibility of a collective hallucination like that. And then the myth, the idea, it was just made up 300 years after the fact by the church. That's been done to death over and over again. Or that it was this grand conspiracy. We're going to make up the story, and these fishermen from Galilee, we're going to make up this story and see if we can trick the whole world into believing in Jesus. Once again, it is the martyrdom of these men that tells against the idea that it's a conspiracy. Also, to think that 12 peasants could come up with a story that is now the foundational narrative of Western civilization doesn't seem likely that they could pull that off. And again, the cost to believe that as compared to the cost just to believe that that's what happens, I don't think they really, the cost of those two things even compares. So it's tough to have an explanation for the event, an alternative explanation for the actual event of Jesus rising again from the dead. Secondly, the account of subsequent history. The growth of the church. Immediately, this good news is going out and people are believing it, and it is getting to the extremities of the Roman Empire within decades of it happening. It's just hard to believe that's driven by a lie about Jesus' resurrection from the dead. And then I've got their animal sacrifice eliminated. Wherever the gospel went, people stopped sacrificing animals. And we hear that go, well, we don't live in an animal sacrificing context. But before the gospel, everybody sacrificed animals every day as a commonplace. It was as normal and critical and expected and crucial as any custom you can think of. The people of this era believed that storms were averted and plagues were averted and the crops wouldn't fail. They believed that they could have an influence on those things because they sacrificed animals. They had always done it. They had never not known anybody who didn't do it. And immediately the Christians stopped sacrificing animals. It's one of the reasons why Christians got persecuted. Furious that they wouldn't attend these sacrificial celebrations or wouldn't sacrifice animals. The immediacy with which something that was fundamental to the culture goes away just demonstrates the kind of power and reality that I don't believe a lie could justify. And then the universality. This story, which on one level we would agree is enormously strange, once again, foolishness to Greeks, a scandal to Jews. And here's the story. There's this Jewish peasant who says he's God, who is crucified and rises again and is alive now. And when you put your faith in him, your sins are forgiven and you have an eternity. Now, we're familiar with that story. That's why it sounds familiar to us. But try to go back. Would you describe that story as being somewhat strange? This is a different kind of story. In fact, there was no story like it. And so you might expect for most people to go, pfft, or for all people just to go, yeah, you're nuts, you're out of your mind. And yet, and many people did not believe, but many people don't believe today. It spread like wildfire, was transformative to people's lives, reoriented people in their relationships with one another, and took hold. It didn't matter what language, what the existing cultural presuppositions were. The gospel that was rooted in the proclamation of a living, resurrected Savior was believed everywhere and demonstrated its truthfulness everywhere. So it's tough to give an account of what happened over the last 2,000 years without the actual resurrection of Christ from the dead. And then give an account for the underlying uniting narrative of our civilization. Because here's the deal. The gospel, whether you like it or not, is the foundational concept of our civilization. And it's time for us to not be embarrassed to say that. What's beginning to occur is what I'm beginning to understand is the failure of the Enlightenment. Okay, and that's really what fuels most modern unbelief in the truthfulness of Christianity. What the Enlightenment said is this, and you ought to write this down and think about it. All right, what the Enlightenment said is rationality and empiricism are sufficient to orient every person in the world. Rationality, which is just logic. If you just use your logic, use your reasoning skills. 1 + 1 = 2. Just logic. And then empiricism means observation of the data. If you'll just look at the phenomena of the created order and use your rational mind, that is enough to tell us how to live, how to act, how to relate to one another, how to get along in the world. And that experiment has been running for 350 years, which I think is a good long time to run an experiment. And how's it gone? All right? That logic and the facts are sufficient to orient people on how to live and how to relate and how to find meaning in life. How's that experiment gone? It's failed. It's failed. And what we see is a culture with more facts than ever before, by exponentially more facts. And we're as cuckoo as we have ever been, and we demonstrate we readily believe things that are bonkers. All right? And we're not doing well. We're sick in our souls, and we're sick in our minds, and we're sick in our relationships. Because just having the facts and our rationality aren't enough. We need, instead, what we're learning is we need a story. We need a way to live. You need a way to live. And the gospel story is this. Here's the resurrection story. The most faithful individual willingly endures the worst possible experience for the totally undeserving, and he wins. That's the gospel story. That's what saves us, and then that's what gives us a way to live. It doesn't matter who you are or where you're from or what your background is or what your ethnicity or your race or your gender. If you will believe in this one who died and rose again for you and beat death for you, and you'll begin to live His way, you too will be someone who loves everyone, loves the undeserving, lays your life down, believes that giving is better than taking, that loving is better than hating, that forgiving is better than holding grudges. You become a force of redemption in the world. It's a crazy idea. And it's an idea that the world hates. We think taking is better and hating is better and smashing others, our enemies, is better. But shockingly, if you'll live the way of Christ, there's redemption in life. And while all of Western culture, even people who say they don't believe in God, they believe that you should treat others as you want to be treated. At least they say they do. Let me ask you, here's a pop quiz. Do you think you should treat others the way you want to be treated? That's true and that's a good idea? Feeling good about that? Feeling good you go out on the street and say, would you agree with me? Christian or not, atheist or not, you would agree with me that you should treat people the way you want to be treated. You would get a universal yes. And that idea, our culture exists on that. If you said that to a pre-Christian Anglo-Saxon in let's say the 4th century AD, hey, you should treat people the way you want to be treated. What would the 5th century pagan Anglo-Saxons say? They'd laugh you out of the room. That's the worst idea in the world. What would an Anglo-Saxon think if you treated everybody the way you wanted to be treated? You're a weakling. They'd stomp your face in, and they'd be right. Nobody thinks that's the right idea. You go around and ask people, do you believe all people are of equal value? Even if you find secular people that, yes, all people are of equal value. If you said that to Genghis Khan, is that what he thinks is true? Again, he would laugh. No. Here's what you need to do to be happy and get along in the world. You kill everybody who's not like you. Destroy them all. Kill them all before they do it to you. These things that make our culture possible are because of the resurrection of Christ from the dead. The fundamental superstructure of our civilization rests on Jesus being alive again from the dead. I know that's a big claim. I realize that, and you may have to go back and think about that a little bit. But here's what I want to say. If that's not the story, then what is the story? And I'm going to give you, because I've already paddled beyond the buoys anyway, so I'll just keep chucking stuff at you. Because here is the narrative that's being suggested, and you can watch it in Marvel movies, okay? Marvel movies no longer want to tell a hero story. This individual who goes out and confronts evil and lays his or her life down for others in order to rescue and to redeem. We don't want to tell that story anymore. We're going to tell this woke story. And the woke story is this. I wrote it down. The hero now is the secret inherent virtues and powers of a member of a marginal group suddenly emerge and are recognized by everybody else as overpowering the oppressors. This is the new story that's being told. So in most of these stories, there's no individual growth. There's no growing up or discovering a superordinate moral code. It's just getting everybody to know how great you already are and how wonderful you already are and how you need to make really no changes. Everyone else just needs to acknowledge your awesomeness. And the reason they won't acknowledge your awesomeness is not because you're not awesome, but because they only like people in their group. And so the only thing to be done with them is to destroy them. And then once all the oppressors are destroyed, then, well, something else will happen. And that idea doesn't work. No one wants to watch it because no one wants to believe it because it's not believable. The most powerful story there is this: Jesus rose again from the dead. It's not only true. This is kind of a goofy point I'm making. I realize that, but y'all are my guinea pigs. I try all these ideas on y'all first. It's not only true, it's the truest thing there is. It's the thing that makes truth possible. It's the thing that makes truth understandable. It's the thing that makes us able to discern between what is true and what is false. For so long, Christians, we have been a little embarrassed of the miraculous in the Bible, a little bit embarrassed that our religion really says that a dead guy rose again. We kind of, and so we get tricked into saying, well, what's really important about Christianity is being nice. What's really important about Christianity is, can't we all just get along? And fine, being nice is fine, I guess, and getting along is fine. But the power of the gospel, the power that forgives sin and changes hearts and lives, sets people on a whole new direction, breaks the back of addiction, breaks the back of generational hate and sin and brokenness, is that Jesus is alive from the dead. And we don't hide it, we lead with it. We don't tell somebody at the end, we announce from the very beginning, there's good news. That's what the good news means. The good news is God has done in Christ the everything and the only thing that can save any sinner and every sinner. And that's what makes life worth living. And so this is the good news that we get to share with a world that has always had a hard time believing it, but knows that it needs to be true. Let me pray for you. Thank you for an extra 20 minutes tonight, and I'll let you get going. God, we love you. We thank you for the truth of your word. Help us to not a confidence in our flesh, because we're warned against that, but a confidence in your word, a confidence in the incredible, incomprehensible truthfulness of what your scriptures claim and what we believe. Lord, help us to be so enthused and enthralled with the goodness and truthfulness of the gospel that we just can't help sharing it with others. Help us to learn how to do it. Help us to step towards people in love and gentleness and respect and courage, not to just be put off by an objection, but to keep the conversation going, because Jesus is better. Give us the courage to share that good news in Jesus' name. Amen.